Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
For the past 6 weeks, we have been bringing you a series entitled Beyond Darkness, A Human Response. That series was possible because of the North Idaho College Convocation series, and Jean Ann Mitchell has been the chair of that committee for a couple of years, and we commend her and her committee for dealing with what was a very serious topic, but one that was very, very important. We thought it would be very appropriate to conclude that 6-week series by having an additional program in which we would analyze and summarize some of the major issues that were involved during that series. In order to accomplish that goal, I would like to welcome to the program two people who are very involved in the series. First of all, to my far left is Richard Snyder, who is in the Department of Anthropology and assisted in putting that program in place. And of course, Jean Ann Mitchell, who is next to Mr. Snyder, as I've indicated, over this past 6 weeks has chaired that committee and was really the person that really brought everything together and chose some very, very important topics. We welcome both of you to the program, and Jean Ann, I want to particularly thank you for having the courage and the foresight to deal with something that is so important and how we can progress and move ahead by discussing things in society that oftentimes are not pleasant, but also very much part of the human experience.
Thank you. It was our intent when we put the program together to focus on something that would raise the consciousness of the community, and by that I don't mean the outside community, I mean the entire North Idaho College community. Something that is bypassed, something that's overlooked, something that isn't talked about. We thought it was time for substantive kinds of things to be presented that students could carry away and talk about. I think we did that.
And I want to welcome Janelle Berg, who is an attorney in Idaho and is a member of our panel each week, and I would ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Well, you kind of explained part of what my first question was going to be. Beyond Darkness, a Human Response. What does that mean, Jean Ann, and how did you happen to choose that particular theme?
Well, this was a result of a lot of bouncing around before it settled down on a specific item. We were looking at oppression, but oppression is not a topic that captivates people, so we had to come up with Beyond Darkness, a human response. Some of the issues we were considering was, let's not do something way out there that we're out of touch with. Let's do something that affects people right here, right now, in our own community, so that when the issues are opened up, we can respond to it here and not say it's out there. Even Ray Stone's Holocaust experience, he's walking around with that inside of him, and so are veterans walking around with feelings inside of them. So we landed pretty much on the topics. There were more topics, we couldn't have them all. That was our problem.
Jean Ann has explained a bit about what the purpose was of the program in her answer to my question, but can you perhaps explain that in more detail? What was the purpose of this program to reach, I know, the college community, but the general community as well, on a variety of subjects that were important to people? How would you express that purpose?
In my mind, I think it's easy to sit here at North Idaho College and share our own problems and deal with our problems on a day-to-day basis. And the farther that we start to think away from ourselves or our community, the more hazy problems become. And I think the end result is that we think the only problems that exist are here in our own community. We're most familiar with those, and that they tend to be unique problems. And by bringing people in from other parts of the country, as well as locally, and certainly some guests were from Spokane, one from right here in Coeur d'Alene, you see that there's a broad spectrum to the problem, and that it's not just a local issue, it's a national issue that has to be dealt with locally, it has to be dealt with nationally. These are things worth talking about from people walking the streets, and I know from my own church experience that there are soup kitchens in town, and people being put up at night, and families being put up, and people spending money and giving food to help these people. They're here. They're also in Washington, D.C., and in New York City and elsewhere. So I think it gives a perspective to the problem, and it's a week of focusing on these things on a variety of levels.
I have been looking over the programs that we did that our viewers have already seen. There were 6 of those I indicated, and all of these issues that I'm going to review those very quickly, don't necessarily tie together and relate. They all involve a problem. But that was, I think, one thing important about this topic. You didn't have to have issues as we do in some cases. For example, one time we did genetic engineering where there was a very close tie. You talked about, well, what is genetic engineering, and what are the ethical questions, and what should the public policy. This was a very different format. I know during those 6 weeks we've talked about competition, and Mr. Cohn indicated that he thought competition had created a real problem for our society and people and their relationships. We also talked about the Soviet Union and oppression of the Soviet Union from the viewpoint of Mr. Finkel, and how he escaped what he considered a very controlled society. And then Ray Stone was here, and he talked about the Holocaust and the incredible tragedy that took place with that. And then we had from Eastern Washington University a professor dealing with communications and how TV, in his viewpoint, had affected people maybe in a way that was very different from what we would like for it to do. And then we had Beulah Lund, who had been so courageous and had gone out and met and lived with the homeless. And then Susan Sheen had a lot of areas to cover, such as the mentally ill and her experience in Vietnam and prison and so forth. Now with that, I have a question about how all that involves. What did both of you come away with after listening to those? And then we had also a program in the college on incest. It was not on this program because of a time scheduling problem. Gina and I will start with you. You were involved in all of it as the coordinator and heard it all. What did you come away with? How did it, I would assume, overwhelm you? Was it of a greater magnitude than you thought before the series started, as what was going on in the country and in the world?
Our focus was here, right here. Sure, it's going on all over the world, but a lot of people's response and their attitude, well, is I can't do anything about out there. So we tried to focus on what's being carried around here, as well as what's out there, but really what is here. And I think one of the things we were trying to do was expand the awareness level to maybe change attitudes. If nothing else, to pose the question, what am I going to do about it the next time I see a competitive put down? One little issue, right down on the personal level. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to do when I hear a veteran say something about Vietnam? You know, am I going to say, oh, that was 20 years ago, turn it off, I don't want to hear it? Or are we going to respond? What about the student that comes unglued in the classroom when some of these issues are discussed in my area on a developmental level, and all of a sudden you know you've hit a chord? Beulah Lund certainly hit a chord when she was talking about living on the street. It's something I haven't experienced. I don't think any of you here have experienced it. But she was very personal, and I think that identifies for the student. They can live with it through these people. What I wanted was to raise the consciousness that exists and then pose the question, what can I do?
Richard Smith.
I found helpful the great number of people, speakers we had that had personally experienced Beulah Lund on the street, Sheehan in a woman's home with a lot of kids in New York City, Ray Stone driving in the gates of a concentration camp. They had been there, and somehow over the years those things tend to fade into memory, and we live so much by secondhand information that I think once in a while it's nice to pop up some people that were actually there and speak in the first person. I've just recently been speaking with some of my students about the fact there are a number of languages in the world that have no past tense. And so their mythology is in the present, rather than a long time ago something happened. Every generation and so Coyote was going along right now. And that keeps them very much in the present, in the first person, in the right there. And we tend to relegate, I think, very easily things into the past and move on to new things. And I was impressed with that part of the program, the people who had been there. Again, Sheehan, having been all of the place, I have to like her. She's a sort of sideline anthropologist. She's out there right in the middle of it finding out what's going on rather than in a library finding out what's going on. So
I think that's one of the very important contributions of this series at North Idaho College, and we have carried it to viewers beyond our campus, and that is, we in our culture have had a real tendency to not want to think of history. History is something in modern times it's not been studied by lots of people, and if we don't study history, if we don't learn what's happened in the past, and it's continuing to happen, doesn't that endanger the human within our history? In other words, it can be more likely to be somehow repeated if we don't learn lessons from it. Do you think that was something that was contributed to not only our viewing audience but our students?
I think that was contributed in a most unique way. These people, because they shared their own personal experience, were able to create something alive. And no one can have emotions and feelings about something and speak of them to someone else without that person imbibing in the emotions, if you want to use that word. I think these people did that and made it very alive. You know, it's so easy to pick up the newspaper and read a murder and read a this and read a that and read the funnies and then read the sports page and be done with the newspaper, or TV. A soundbite for 30 seconds on soap, and then one on a death on the streets in New York, and then one on the president's wife getting on an airplane in a new outfit, and so sensitized not to feel anything. And these people brought their own personal life right on the line, right to us, and shared that with us. I don't know how anyone could not come away from that feeling part of what they gave to us. I think that was really a super thing that happened there.
Janelle Burke.
I would like to follow up with Tony's rather general questions with some specific questions about individual programs and have you perhaps indicate whether you agreed or disagreed with the speaker and perhaps what you thought to be the most important part of that person's message. Let's start with the person who spoke about competition. Alfie Cohn, he spoke about competition. He says, why we all lose in our race to win. Jean Ann, would you like to start perhaps by saying what you think his theory or his thesis was, and then kind of how you felt about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, Alfie spoke from what he sees, and I tune into what he says because I see it in the classroom so much. We set up situations where one child is the winner and the rest are second, thirds, fourths, fifths, and on down the line.
And he was speaking generally that competition, he felt competition could be harmful.
Very harmful, very harmful. From remarks such as, who's going to be first? Parents, who's done it the best? I mean, he was talking business, school, the family. I think his thesis was extremely acceptable. I think it rocked a few boats in that he challenged some of the yuppie books that are how to get ahead and fast, as he put it. How many faces have you walked on today? Oh good, you're the winner. You're the clear winner. How many faces? So.
And from your perspective, from your particular field of work, how did you view what he had to say, or how would you view that thesis that competition can be harmful?
Well, I think his ideas of cooperative models are very much non-Western society ideas.
And he, I believe, mentioned that that there are societies in the world in which competition does not play the part that it does in our society.
Whether or not there is such a thing as a society with no competition, I would have a hard time agreeing with. I think it's a matter of how pervasive the competition is, how repetitive it is, and how destructive it is. And certainly within our society, there are numerous occasions in which people are pitted against each other needlessly, when in effect we could all be winners. I like particularly his idea of why do we have several people doing the same thing in competition with each other rather than working cooperatively, rather than the repetitiveness of it and the repetitive cost of doing all of that as well. And I think it was significant that companies like IBM have contacted him to find out about his claims that cooperative models can increase their bottom line. Of course, they're very much pragmatic and want to know, how do we increase the profits? And I have to go along when he says that any situation that pits one human being against another so that the success of one is dependent upon the failure or destruction of the other is not in the best interest of anybody. I have to agree, warfare is certainly that, and I don't see any immediate value to it. There may be long-term benefits that I don't understand. How about just locally, in our own community, where people seem to be at loggerheads to who's going to be first when we could be working cooperatively? It is, I think, a very foreign idea to many people in the United States, and that sort of sets them against it to start out with.
I think if you look at how much energy is wasted when four people, say, work on a project, and half that energy is keeping your eye on your neighbors so that you can measure where am I in this group, instead of putting all the energy on the one thing you want to accomplish. If there's only reward for one of the four, where will the energy be? It's wasted. It's wasted energy. For me.
This has been very interesting. I want to move along a little bit, and so I don't take up all the time, to also ask about Mr. Finkel and his description of Russia. He had lived in Russia and had come to this country. And perhaps just a little bit, why don't we start with Mr. Snyder and then have Jean Ann fill in a little bit, just a couple of thoughts about what he had to say and his descriptions.
I think he had to say that the Jews in Russia are a kind of a repeat of the Jews in the land of Goshen, and Moses was struggling with Pharaoh, let my people go. And it's very hard to get out of there. It is oppressive. It's still home. And so there's going to be this idea, it's still home. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and despite the incredible chaos, there's still a tug that it's home, and there's a feeling of that, I think, in it. But he did make it, and maybe things are loosening up a little.
I saw him as speaking out against whether it's a group of people or one individual person trying to escape the group rule that is so tight, and then the repercussions of that. It took him 8 or 9 years to get out of Russia, with much intervention on the part of our government, as well as petitions, etc., etc. And the punishment, the way he was punished within his own culture for attempting to leave and be with his wife in this country. Susan had to come out of Russia and have her baby here to have it be declared an American citizen. She was very fearful of having her baby in Russia and having it end up a Russian citizen, and then the trap door would have been sprung shut. No mother can leave their daughter. Then they would have been fixed in Russia. As it turned out for him, it worked out the other way. But it was 8 years of losing his job, of not having enough money, of not seeing his wife, of not being a father.
And yet he is my understanding, teaching the Russian language at Whitworth, and those are the kinds of things that then we understand where he is coming from, and that is a service to us too, to be able to learn about the Russian language from his cultural perspective. He's able to teach the language with some of the culture built into it. I'll let Tony go on.
We'll continue on that same vein. Another person that was here that was so impressive was Beulah Lund, and we've talked a little bit about that. I would like for both of you to give us your impression of how she articulated the plight of the homelessness country. Didn't she send us such a strong message as someone who for 6 weeks lived in that situation herself? what have we done to the homeless? Would you give us your critique of what she had to say about that?
Go ahead, lead off.
I had a feeling that she disagreed with Ronald Reagan, that those people were there for reasons other than they were choosing to be there. I mean, I don't know that that's true. I'm just responding to her. That circumstances seem to place them in the situation. Perhaps lack of education at some points, making a wrong turn at another, and once you get one foot into it, it's the tar baby. You're mired down, and the more you struggle, the deeper you get in, and that it's very difficult to lift yourself out with your own bootstraps, and that some kind of help is needed.
Both Beulah Lund and Susan Sheen discussed this, because and even off the air I was talking to Susan about in New York where there's so many homeless, and she says people become hardened and they just step over them, or they look beyond them, look through them. And Beulah Lund indicated that it is the most dehumanizing experience, that one's self-esteem is all destroyed. Jean Ann, would you like to react to that you got that message so strongly from both
I got
those
it very
people?
strongly. I was out with Beulah for lunch, and I can't remember if she said this on the air or if she said it on the stage or if she said it to us privately at lunch. Afterwards, she was to have an interview with Peter Jennings. She said she arrived and she was in her street clothes, filthy dirty, no shampoo, no hand washing for 2 and 3 weeks at a time, and that she could not lift her head and look up at him. She felt so dirty and so part of the streets that she was not any longer part of this world, so entrapped. And the culture shock for her to come out of that. It took her a good 6 weeks to come back out of it. The ability to feel clean, to feel like she had a right to walk in and use her own things in her own home. There was a period of going into it and being there, and also a period coming out. She said there's no way those people can adjust. You can't have them a check and say there, take a bath and go into society. The culture shock is long-term, long-term.
With that in mind, I would like to give you one impression I had and get your reaction to it. After we had done all these programs, and I remember the last one with Susan Sheen, I think she made a really profound point. She indicated those who are of a liberal or progressive persuasion were convinced some time ago that in our mental institutions we'd institutionalize so many people and that we should change that policy, which we have, and we've brought many people back out of the institutions. And she seemed to be struggling with, what is the answer, that it seems so humane to get people out of institutions that were just so poor and in structure and facilities and so depressing. But many of those have gone from that setting, which was not oftentimes a good one, to becoming homeless and on the street. And she says, which is better, being on the street or being in an institution that's not what it should be. And it just impacted me that she was saying, as some of the other speakers, is this is a tremendous problem. It's a growing problem. There is a widening gap between the poor and the rich, and also those that did not even have shelter or food. Did you get that impression that though they were committed to trying to solve this problem, that they seemed to be overwhelmed by the problem?
I think numbers is overwhelming them, and I think we need an interim step between institutionalized and part of the culture that can't come out and be part of the culture. There's an adjustment period. I don't recall that she mentioned anything about some kind of a halfway house setup, but that you just can't transplant them from one culture to another culture and expect them to take root and go. I think the thing that Beulah Lund stressed very much was we have a generation of children who know only the street. She mentioned possibly over lunch a woman who had a nursing baby, 3 months old, living in a refrigerator box in the back of a refrigerator sales shop, and they hooked her up in electric blankets so she could stay warm at night. This child will not know a normal life, and I think Beulah was saying over and over again, our institutions, our prisons won't be able to hold the angry people that come off the streets. Definitely. I think there's got to be interim steps there.
Janelle Berg.
one of the speakers also talked about his remembrance of the Holocaust, and that was Ray Stone. Would you like to indicate what you feel he was saying in terms of people not seeing, who were right there in Germany at the time, not seeing what was going on, and whether it really did occur? Let's start with Jean Ann.
Well, I had a brother who was in Stalag Luft 3, and the Germans weren't told. They didn't know, and they didn't ask questions because their survival was based on, I'm not saying that excuses behavior, but a great part of the population didn't know what was happening in those camps. They certainly saw people disappearing, and out of fear, I think they bought into it. And Ray laid the background of how Hitler came to being. And it wasn't until after the war that my brother was fully informed as to what was happening there, and it's been wiped out of the history books to augment the German support for the Western fight against communism that occurred immediately after the war. So I don't think those people knew. I don't think a lot of them knew. There were some of them that knew, but they were into survival by that point in time. I'm not excusing it.
And did what he saw say that it really happened?
I don't know that I disagree. Myself, I find it silly to say that it didn't happen. I think the evidence is so overwhelming. I was also extremely impressed with Ray Stone, whom I've known for a good many years, and I could see on his face and read in his eyes, this wasn't Ray Stone. This was somebody else at another time, as these things started to come out, and a tremendous commitment to, we cannot forget how all this happened. And on the other hand, and I'm going to sound wishy-washy, I have a great deal of sympathy for the man on the street in Germany, because there were concentration camps in the United States, and there were Japanese Americans in them. And there was a concentration camp in New York State that had 1,500 Jews in it that were taken by the United States out of Europe through pleading, and they were put in a concentration. Now, they weren't gassed, they weren't laid out on pallets to sleep. Conditions were better than that. And I wonder, in towns near the camps with the Japanese Americans in them, or near that camp in New York, I wonder how many people in towns knew what was going on.
I must interrupt. We're out of time. I want to thank both of you for being here. And again, I want to publicly thank Jean Ann Mitchell for bringing us such a very important subject to try to move beyond darkness to a better way in life. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed hearing this discussion today, and it's very serious, and we hope that we've been helpful, as I've indicated, to move beyond negative behavior to treating humans in a proper way. Please be with us again next week. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.